Hi, kids. This is Paul Rogers. You probably have seen me at the gathering on Sunday mornings there at Faith Church. But before we go any further today is Mother's Day. And I hope you've already done something for Mom. Got her, maybe made her a card, picked some flowers, whatever it is. But if you haven't, I encourage you to do that. Now, I made a card here just as a sample. And I just want you to, maybe this is something that maybe you could do too. You don't have to do it as good as this. Maybe you could do something nicer. Or maybe the same, I don't know. But do something for Mom today, okay? Well, I also want to let you know that since this quarantine's been on, I want to let you know what I've been doing. I've been sitting here on this couch. You got to have a good couch during quarantine. Also, you have to have plenty of snacks. And you have ample snacks. So there's my snacks. Besides the snacks and the couch, I'm going to be watching a lot of good TV. So there's what I've been watching. So now today, for the lesson, Jake's going to go take us into the Bible and talk to us about Esther and Elijah and some big decisions they had to make. And they had some people to help them with these decisions. Maybe you've got some big decisions you have to make. So this will be a lesson to maybe you want to hear about. Thank you. See ya.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning to you, FSM. It's good to be together. I'm Jake, and this morning I was thinking about a couple of different things, one of them being signs, and so I just wanted to show you a few of these. This is a very clear sign, right? Stop means stop, and everybody knows that, right? What about this one? This is a little less clear and not as universal. No Jake break. That is how I wrecked my first car. And then this sign I took a picture of when I was in Europe about 12 years ago. It's a very clear sign, but I'm not sure you can see that one. It says, lost children. I would never want a child in that building, right? Clear, but concerning. Here's this one. I also took a photo like this in Europe. Warning, anti-climb paint. What does that even mean? And then there's some that take some translation here. This one, Milk Junior Parkway, DMS Airport, right? Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway, some airport. And then some signs get lost in translation. Look at this one, delayed due to some reason. Well, that doesn't answer any of my questions. And then some signs are wondering why they exist. Here we go, Tourist Center, that's clear. This one, garden with curled poo. Why would I want to go there? Why would I want to look at that? And so here's the thing. Life is kind of like that. We get a lot of signs and sometimes they are really clear. Sometimes they leave us going, God, what do you actually mean by that? And then sometimes they don't show up at all. And we've got questions and we go, well, can you give me a sign? Can you help me out? Can you give me a little bit of something? Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about our doubts and questions, and this week we want to talk about one way that God gives us a sign or a way to answer some of those questions. I know in my life, I asked questions about all of those things. Like when I wanted to go to school, I was thinking, do I want to go to a small college in Oregon? Do I want to go all the way across the country to Liberty? And then you know what? It changed, and I finished online at Liberty at home while working a job that I never thought I would have. And then as I got a little bit older, 19, 20, I moved again to Hawaii and then to California. And every single time I asked questions, I tried to ask God, where do you want me to go? And sometimes I was wondering if I was ever even going to hear from him. Today, I want to tell you about a woman named Esther. She lived at a time when the Israelite people were in captivity by the Persians. Their king was named Xerxes. One evening, while he was throwing a party with officials from all over the kingdom, he asked his wife to come out and parade her beauty in front of all of them. She refused, and Xerxes had enough. He threw her out of the palace and decided it was time to find a new queen. He searched all over his empire, demanding that women come from every nationality and background, whether they liked it or not. And that's where Esther's story comes in. In fact, in Esther chapter 2, verse 8, we read this. As a result of the king's decree, along with many other young women, Esther was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Haggai's care. Haggai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best palace in the harem. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. Esther has her chance to become queen. Whether she likes it or not, she made the best of it. She found favor, got great treatment, and her cousin turned adoptive father, Mordecai, never gave up on her and never moved on. She continued in this process to take a chance to become queen. But here's the thing. If I'm Esther, I'm asking a lot of questions. I would even be a little bit worried because I know that Xerxes doesn't treat women well. And I know that he threw the last queen out. So if I win this, what does it mean for me? Esther's story continues in verse 15 with this. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set a royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. That is a win. That's exciting. If I'm Esther, I'm excited. My life has just changed, hopefully for the better. But at the same time, I'd be like, God, what are you up to? This guy has a history of mistreating women, so there's good things happening, but what is he going to do to me? What happens if he gets fed up with me just like he did his previous wives? What happens then? And she begins to ask some questions, but at the same time, we know that her spiritual guide and adoptive dad never gave up on her. He's still there, ready to answer questions, and this is what we see in verse 19. Even after all the young women had been transitioned to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she had done when she lived in his home. Mordecai was there as a spiritual advisor to keep helping Esther along her life's process. Even with those worries, she made the best of a bad situation. She continued to follow Mordecai's advice, and she rose in favor with the king. In fact, together, they shut down a plot to have him assassinated. However, at the same time, a man named Haman was growing in power in the kingdom as well. He was letting that power get to his head, and he was even making people bow down to him and treat him like he was king too. Mordecai was not going to have it, and Haman really didn't like that. Check out what it says in Esther chapter 3, verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. And he learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. He then went to Xerxes and he explained his plan, telling him that Jews had no place in his kingdom because they would never bow to him as king. He got the approval to pass whatever decree he wanted, so that's exactly what he did. And this is what we read in chapter 3, verse 12. So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors, and the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and language. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. This was all going on outside the palace walls. Mordecai, Esther's family, the Jewish nation, was very aware of it, but inside, Esther didn't know what was happening. Mordecai, once again, was not going to let Esther go uninformed. So he found a way to get a message into the palace. And in Esther chapter 4, verse 7, we read this. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. If I'm Esther, I'm wondering what the heck is going on. I didn't choose to be born into captivity. I didn't want my parents to die, and I didn't even want to become queen. And now I'm stuck in an impossible situation, stuck between the king who is my husband and the nation that I'm related to. Esther tries to explain that to Mordecai, and in verse 10, she sends this back to him. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time, like this, deliverance will relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? Esther wrestled with this. She asked her maids to fast. She sent Mordecai to tell her family to fast on her behalf too. She ultimately made the decision to go before the king, and she ends chapter 4 with the message that goes, I'm going to go in before the king, and if I die, I die. Esther knew she had to make the right decision. She got guidance from spiritual advisors like Mordecai, and ultimately it paid off. Right in the nick of time, Mordecai reversed the decree. He found out Haman's plot, and he actually put Haman to death for his abuse of power and tricking him. That is an amazing story. But here's what I notice about it. God isn't mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. But just because God wasn't mentioned doesn't mean he was absent from the situation. In fact, what we see is Esther calls for her family to fast, and I imagine prayer was part of that. But you know what we don't know? We don't know if it was. The only thing that we do know from the story is that Esther, over and over again, sought out godly wisdom from the godly people in her life. That's the thing. Today we go, you may have some questions. You may wonder what's next for you, and that's where the godly people in your lives come in. Like we said at the beginning, life is full of choices and decisions that we have to make. In my story, I had friends that talked me through which college I would go to before I ultimately settled on Liberty. I had friends that I talked to through my moves to Hawaii and California and back. And what's cool is I saw God work in each of those places. I also had mentors that talked me through times when life got hard and I didn't want to persevere through it. They helped me understand that fighting through the tough times is important too. We've shared how important good friends are, but it's also important to know that we need godly people who give us advice of all different ages and backgrounds so that we can make the best decisions. There used to be a famous game show called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It's actually made a little bit of a comeback recently, so maybe you've seen it. But you know that they have lifelines to get some help on a question when they're maybe struggling. One of them is phone a friend. My guess is they had a history buff and a sports fan and a pop culture expert all on the line, ready to answer the call when the time came. Who are your phone a friend people? I have a short list of people that I was thinking through, a short list of categories, and they may not have that job title, but they fill the role in your life. I'm gonna give you the title, a little explanation, and then a few seconds to maybe think who that person is in your life. The first person I would think of is who's your cheerleader? Who's the person in your life that's always ready to encourage you, always ready to be excited about your newest, latest news? What about this one? Who is your counselor? the person who's ready with great advice, ready to talk you through a new problem or a tough situation you're stuck in? Who's your confidant? Who's the person you can go to and share anything without feeling judged and with feeling like it's going to remain a secret? Who's your coach? Somebody who's ready to encourage you, make you better, and more prepared for what's coming ahead. How about this one? Who's your pastor? Again, it doesn't have to be a job title, but who's the person that's ready with godly wisdom and advice, going to open the Bible with you and help you dig in to what God's word says about your current situation? Who is your mentor? Who's the older person in your life that's speaking wisdom in? Who's telling you, hey, I've been there and this is how I've handled it, or how I wish I would have handled it? Who's your prayer support? The person that you can share anything with and know that they're going to go to bat with God on your behalf. What we know is that we need a variety of people to help us connect with God. You need a team of people of all ages, of all different skills and all different backgrounds to help us see where our future's going. This team of godly people who in different ways connect us with wisdom that God has for our life. Sometimes I think we sit and think that wisdom from God can only be stoic and deep, but sometimes wisdom from God comes from that coach who encourages you to get better, or that cheerleader who says, just keep going. And with that, that's how we wrap up this series. Starting next week, we're going to begin to answer your questions that you've asked, that you've submitted to the link online on our social media, on the video description, on our website, or even in the newsletter. It's all the same link. You can still submit questions there because we're going to spend 2 weeks answering them. But before we do that, I want to remind you, we've been talking about a couple of things. Number one, we've been talking about the fact that you're not alone in your questions, that all of us have questions about our faith, questions about God, and even doubts. Number two, God doesn't shame us for those questions. We talked about the idea that God is okay when we mentioned that we have questions. Number three, we said sometimes in life we don't get answers to those questions, but we still need to trust that God is working even in those situations. And today we're saying this: when we can't find answers on our own, God gives us godly people who can help us find those answers and who can guide us through life. Next week, I hope that me and some others can maybe begin answering your questions for you so that you can begin to understand God a little bit better. But with that, let me pray for you and we'll close out this morning. Dear God, thank you for this series. Thank you for your word that shows us over and over again that questions are okay. That you're not intimidated by our questions, that we're not just going to figure out some big hoax, but that in fact it's just a part of life. Today, God, can you help us make a list of who our cheerleaders and coaches and counselors and pastors and prayer supports and mentors and confidants are, so that we know how to better engage life with you and the godly people that you've blessed us with. God, can you help us this week begin to see how those people have helped us in the past and can help us in the future? We love you, Lord. In your son's name we pray. Amen. And with that, I'd love to invite you to stick around for worship and main service. Other than that, we'll see you on Wednesday for D group and right back here next Sunday where we're going to start answering some of your questions. See ya.